The question left her mouth before she had finished forming it, and once it had, there was no manner of retrieving it. She had heard enough from the landing to understand what Lord Ashmore had come to do. He had arrived at Henrietta Street, as men of his station arrived everywhere, with the settled confidence of someone who expected the arrangement of things to proceed as arranged, and he had asked her brother Robert for permission to speak to her, as though she were a property described in the terms of a lease, and not a woman standing 12 feet away, with her ears and her capacity for anger fully intact. She came down the last 4 stairs, and he turned, and the question she put to him was quiet enough that the footman at the hall table could not have heard it. She asked him why he needed permission from anyone. Lord Ashmore looked at her. Not through her, not past her, not with the practiced social blindness she had grown accustomed to in London drawing rooms. He looked at her as though the question had landed somewhere he had not expected, and for a long moment, in the narrow hallway of a hired lodging that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool, he said nothing at all. That silence would occupy Nora McCarthy for a considerable time. She had not come to London expecting to be moved by anything, except perhaps necessity. The season of 1814 had descended on the city with its customary indifference to the circumstances of those who could not afford it, and the McCarthy family's circumstances were, by that October, sufficiently reduced that Nora was grateful the Chandlers had not yet cut off their credit. Robert was 28, pleasant, genuinely fond of his sister, and in debt to the sum of £2,000 to a man named Gerald Caldwell, whose affability was so thorough and so consistent that it had taken Nora 3 encounters to recognize it as instrument rather than character. She wore a gown that had been retrimmed twice. The original silk was deep green and had been her mother's, and the new trimming was ivory, and it was neat, and it was undeniably not what the other women in the assembly room were wearing. She had assessed it in the glass before departing, and had permitted herself exactly 1 moment of honest inventory before setting the inventory aside. There was nothing to be done about the gown. It was at the first assembly of the season, at a room in King Street that smelled of too many candles and rose-water applied with military discipline, that she heard it for the first time. A quartet wedged near the curtained windows was playing something with more energy than precision, and the room had accumulated the dense heat of 200 bodies and 300 candles until the air near the floor carried a distinct smell of warmed wax and powder, and the breath of too many conversations happening at once. The woman who said it was perhaps 45, with the posture of someone who had worn diamonds long enough to absorb their properties, and she delivered the verdict quietly to the woman beside her, with the tone of a matter already decided. "No portion," she said, "and Irish." Her companion murmured something. The woman with the diamonds said nothing further on the subject, and turned the conversation to the merits of a blue silk across the room, and that was the whole of it. The whole of Nora McCarthy, in 2 phrases, delivered to an adjacent chair as though she were an item in an estate catalogue. Nora did not allow herself to stand still for more than the span of 1 breath. She moved to the window side of the room, found a space between a potted shrub and the wall, and looked at Robert across the floor. Through the glass behind her, the cold street sent back a pale double of the assembly's brightness. Caldwell had one hand resting on Robert's forearm, the posture of a man who is making a point, and making it pleasantly. She could see by the angle of Robert's shoulders that the conversation was the same one it had been all week, the gentle tightening that came with money owed. What she did not see, because she was watching her brother, was the man who had been watching her. He stood near the east wall, with no particular expression on his face, and no particular companion at his side, which was in itself unusual for a man of his rank. The Earl of Ashmore was 31, with the kind of face that gave nothing away. and he had been at the assembly for 20 minutes before he noticed the woman in the green gown standing near the window, as though she were accustomed to occupying the most economical possible portion of any available space. He had not, at that moment, looked away. Nora did not know this. She would not know it for some time. What she knew that evening was that the supper interval came, and she ate very little. And Robert did not come to find her. And Caldwell was visible throughout in a group of men whose laughter was just slightly too frequent to be natural. She went home in a hired carriage that smelled of other people's evenings and looked out at the lit windows of houses she would never be invited into, and permitted herself to note, with the private dry accuracy she allowed herself in the absence of witnesses, that the season was proceeding precisely as she had expected. It was Robert who told her about the debt, though she had suspected it for 6 weeks. He told her on a Tuesday morning over cold toast, with the manner of a man confessing a transgression he expected would be forgiven, which was a quality she had observed in him since they were children, and which she had never ceased to find both endearing and costly. Rain tapped at the window behind him in a pattern that had no discernible rhythm. He pressed his hands flat on the table while he spoke, as though the surface might confirm what his voice was making uncertain, and the room smelled of the cold grate and the burned bottom of the coffee pot. £2,000. Caldwell had extended it informally 2 years prior, had asked nothing of it since, and now the terms were being gently, affably, persistently re-established. "He is not an unreasonable man," Robert said. Nora cut her toast into 4 even pieces. "You are describing the temperature of the water," she said. "Not whether the water is safe." Robert looked at the table. He was a kind man, her brother. He was also a man who had inherited precisely no aptitude for the management of money and precisely no instinct for identifying when someone's good nature was conditional. She did not ask him what Caldwell had proposed. She waited, and in 2 more days, she no longer needed to ask, because Lord Ashmore arrived. He came on a Thursday. She heard him in the entrance hall while she was reviewing the household account book at the writing table in the morning room, and she heard the particular change in the parlor-maid's voice that indicated a caller of unusual quality. There was a brief sound of the umbrella stand being moved, and then the lower register of a male voice giving its name, and then the particular, held-breath quality of a house that has admitted someone it is not certain how to contain. Robert was summoned. There was conversation she could not hear, and then a silence of 20 minutes during which she heard nothing except the street outside and the scratch of her own pen against figures that did not, in any ledger of any kind, produce a result she wished to see. When the parlor-maid came to tell her Lord Ashmore had left, something in the girl's expression communicated more than the announcement itself. Nora set down the pen. She asked, in the pleasant level voice she had long since perfected, for the extraction of accurate information from people who expected her to react, exactly what had been discussed. The parlor-maid told her as much as she had heard. It was enough. Lord Ashmore had not come to pay a social call. He had come, in the full exercise of the period's conventions, to request leave of her brother to begin a formal courtship. He had named his intentions with precision. Robert had thanked him with equal precision and promised an answer within the week, and the Earl of Ashmore had departed as he had arrived, with the settled certainty of a man accustomed to the arrangement of things proceeding as arranged. He had not asked Nora. He had not looked for Nora. As far as the conventions of the season went, he had not needed to. She had been standing there with her shawl still over her arm for perhaps 30 seconds before she made the decision. Then she walked out onto the step into the November air, and Lord Ashmore was still at the end of the street, passing a word with his groom before mounting. She called his name. Not his title. His name. He turned. He came back along the pavement at a measured pace, and when he reached the step below hers, she looked at him without the elaborate apparatus of social neutrality she normally applied at eye level with men who had the power to rearrange her life, and she asked him the question, "Why do you need permission from anyone?" His eyes were the color of smoke over water, and they did not move from her face. The question had gone somewhere in him that was not immediately accessible. He was not performing consideration. He was genuinely arrested by it, in the manner of a man who has assembled an argument on careful ground and found the ground unexpectedly altered beneath him. He opened his mouth. He closed it. "Miss McCarthy," he said, and stopped. The November air lay between them. His horse shifted at the end of the pavement. Somewhere on the next street, a vendor called a price for hot chestnuts, and the sound carried cleanly in the cold. The groom had stopped pretending not to watch them. The horse stood with its ears pitched forward, its breath coming in small white bursts above the pavement stones. He had arrived with an orderly proceeding, and she had named the one assumption at its center that he had not examined, and he had no answer for it that he was willing to speak aloud in a hired street in November to a woman he had watched across a ballroom for 3 weeks without once identifying what he intended to do about it. "I will call again on Friday," he said. Nora returned inside. She closed the door with the quietest possible care, because she understood that the sound of a door had the potential to communicate more than she was willing to communicate, and she stood in the entrance hall with her hand still flat on the wood. She had no idea what she had begun. He came on Friday. He came on the following Monday as well. And by the second visit she had understood enough of the pattern to know that he intended to be present in her vicinity, with a consistency that was neither accidental nor purely procedural. He brought no flowers. He brought no compliments in the ornamental mode that gentlemen deployed in drawing rooms like furniture to fill space. He brought his attention, which was absolute, and gave her the unsettling sensation of being read. On Monday, he arrived with mud still visible at the heel of one boot, which she noticed because she had formed the habit of noticing everything about him that contradicted the tidiness of his public manner, and it indicated, among other things, that he had come directly from somewhere he had not planned to leave. She was accustomed to not being read. She had constructed the habit of invisibility over years, the particular skill of occupying a room in a way that neither attracted nor invited comment, and he dismantled it by the simple expedient of looking at her as though he already knew it was a skill and was choosing not to pretend otherwise. It was on the second Friday, 3 days after the threshold, that he arrived a full quarter-hour early. Nora had not finished with the cook's account. Mrs. Donahue was 64 years old and had been in the McCarthy household since before Nora was born and had recently taken to undercounting her weekly sums by small amounts. And Nora had suspected for a fortnight that the undercounting was intentional, the old woman's private form of subsidy for a family she had served too long to leave and could see too clearly not to worry about. Mrs. Donahue came into the morning room with her account book tucked under one arm and her apron adjusted to the precise center of her body, which was how she presented herself when she had decided in advance that something was not her fault. Her hands were red-knuckled from the cold kitchen, folded over the book's cover. The morning room door was ajar. The parlor maid had not yet announced him. Julian Barrow, Earl of Ashmore, had come in from the vestibule and was waiting in the corridor when he saw through the half-open door a young woman sitting at a writing table, running her finger down a column of household figures. The room's single window faced north, and the morning light that came through it was thin and white, falling exactly across the writing table, so that she sat in it entirely. He saw her add a correction in the margin. He saw her open the small purse at her elbow, count out 6 shillings and 4 pennies, set them in a separate row on the table, and close the book. Then he heard the cook come in from the kitchen passage. "You have miscounted again," Nora said, and her voice was entirely without accusation. She pushed the coins across the table. "This is what you are owed for the week. I have noted the correct figures in the book. Please do not worry about the difference." The cook, who was not a woman given to sentiment in front of her employers, made a sound that was not quite words. She took the coins with hands that did not quite manage steadiness, and Nora turned away before Mrs. Donahue's face could confirm what the hands already had. Nora closed the account book and stood and said something quiet about the evening's menu. And the cook withdrew, and the morning room was still. He waited 3 seconds before stepping back from the door. He had seen her act from principle in a moment she believed private. He had seen her give money she did not have to spare to a servant who had been quietly giving it back in the only way available to her, and he had seen her manage the exchange with a dignity that neither condescended nor performed. He had not expected it. He did not yet know what to do with it. When the parlor maid announced him a moment later, and he came through the door and found her standing at the window, with the account book closed on the table, and nothing in her face to suggest she had any awareness of being observed, he felt the particular discomfort of a man who has been changed by something he had no intention of encountering. Robert was not present. Robert was, with increasing frequency, absent from rooms that contained both his sister and the Earl, a pattern Nora was aware of, and which she suspected had more design behind it than Robert was willing to admit. The morning room held only the two of them, and the cold fire that had been banked too early, and the white light that fell even across the writing table, and the floor, and the chair he took when she indicated it. She indicated the chair. He sat. She sat across the table in the chair furthest from the one nearest his, and they spoke of tolerable things. The merits of Hookham's circulating library. The question of whether the new exhibition rooms at Somerset House were worth the walk in November. The conversation carried the precise quality of two people who had each decided to be careful for entirely different reasons. It was the stack of correspondence that fell. Nora reached for it at the same moment he did, and neither of them reached it in time. And the letters scattered across the table's edge and dropped, and they both moved to gather them. And their hands arrived at the same sheaf at the same instant, and stopped. She could hear the street outside, a dray horse, and the sound of wheels on cold stone, and the fire ticked once in the grate, and neither of them moved. She was 23 years old, and she had been practical about the body's small alarms for as long as she had been permitted to be practical about anything. She understood the sensation at her wrist as information of a type she did not commonly encounter, and she filed it with care in the category of things she would examine with accuracy later, when she was alone. She lifted her hand first. He gathered the letters and set them on the table in a neat arrangement he had no business making neat, and neither of them said anything about what had just occurred in the 3 seconds during which nothing had technically occurred at all. When he left that afternoon, she sat for a long time with the letters in front of her and her hands in her lap, and tried to determine, with the same accuracy she applied to household accounts, what exactly she was calculating now. She did not arrive at a clean figure. 2 days later, a note arrived from Ashmore House, written in a hand that was precise and undecorated. Lord Ashmore would be grateful, it said, if Miss McCarthy might be at liberty to call at his town residence on Thursday next at 11 o'clock, where there was a matter he wished to discuss with her directly. Not, she noticed, a matter he wished to discuss with her brother. With her. She read it twice. She read it a third time, and each reading produced the same answer and the same question, which was that she could not yet determine whether what he intended was a kindness or a continuation of the arrangement she had already asked him to reconsider. She wrote back and said she would come. On Thursday, she arrived at Ashmore House in Curzon Street in the McCarthy carriage, which was old and mended at the harness, and which she had directed to stop at the corner rather than at the door. Curzon Street was quiet at that hour, the November frost still on the ironwork at the railings, and the stone steps pale where the sun had not yet found them. She walked the remaining distance with her hands in her muff, and looked at the front of the house without permitting her face to reflect what she thought of it, which was that it was very large and very still, and that entering it would constitute a form of commitment she had not yet fully defined. She wore the green gown again, because there was no other choice, and she had pinned her hair with the precision of a woman who intended to be taken seriously, and understood that precision in small things was the only armor available to her. She was shown into a study whose walls held shelves of well-read books, and a writing desk arranged with the same unornamental practicality as his letters. There was a fire in the grate. It had been burning long enough that the larger logs had reduced themselves to a deep and even heat, and the room was warm in a way the McCarthy lodgings were not, the kind of warmth that asked nothing of you. The shelves ran to the ceiling on 3 walls, their spines brown and dark green and worn at the edges, and on the desk sat a single sheet of paper weighted by a marble sphere no larger than her fist. There was one portrait on the wall, but it faced away from the room, leaned forward against the plaster with its canvas toward the stone, and she had just enough time to register the fact of it and the deliberateness of its facing before Julian came in. He looked as he always looked, exact, contained, giving nothing away with his face that his hands and his stillness did not offer in its place. He asked her to sit. She sat. He poured 2 cups of tea and set one before her without asking whether she wanted any, which she had come to understand was not discourtesy, but a command dressed as service. The particular way he cared for people without asking their permission to do it. The cup was blue and white transferware, plain in the manner of functional things kept for daily use rather than display, and the tea was good, the smell of it rising in a clean column in the warm air. She held the cup and looked at the fire. She had begun to catalogue these small contradictions. A man who asked a brother's permission and could not answer when the woman herself questioned the asking. A man who arrived early and left promptly, and in the interval made the air in whatever room he occupied feel impossibly organized. A man with a portrait on his wall that he had turned to face the plaster and had not, apparently, moved since. She thought, for a moment, that she had come prepared for whatever he intended to say. She was wrong. He told her about Eleanor. Not as a confession, and not as an explanation offered in anticipation of forgiveness. He told her in the plain manner of someone reporting a fact that had been assessed already and found to be his own fault, and he looked at the fire while he said it. Not at her face. His hands were on the desk, very still, as though he had given the rest of himself permission to speak only by anchoring them there. Eleanor Barrow had come to him at 19 with no practical means of refusal. She had remained in the marriage 18 months, and she had died in the spring of 1812 of a fever that had nothing to do with him, and he had spent 2 years understanding that the fever was not the point. The point was that she had never chosen him. She had simply been given no other direction to go. He said this in one sentence, without ornament, and then he was quiet. Nora looked at the portrait on the wall. In the firelight, the edge of its frame was just visible above the canvas back, a sliver of gilt. He followed her gaze. "I turned it," he said, "because it seemed dishonest to display something I could not face." She sat with that for a moment. The fire shifted in the grate, a log settling with a soft collapse of ash. She had expected, she realized, the kind of account that was also a justification. She had not expected honesty, with no furniture around it. Something in the room altered quietly, the way a space rearranges itself when a window is opened that has been shut too long. Not dramatic, only air. "You have come," she said, "to tell me this before anything else proceeds." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her with the same quality of attention she had come to understand as his form of plain speech. "Because she did not have the opportunity to know what she was agreeing to," he said. "And I find I cannot proceed without ensuring that you do." She was quiet for a moment. The marble sphere on the desk caught the firelight and held it, a small fixed warmth against the dark wood. She thought about Henrietta Street, about the coal smoke smell of the lodgings, and Robert's hands pressed flat on the breakfast table, and the £2,000 that was not a number, but a weight redistributed across her life without her permission. She thought about Mrs. Donoghue red-knuckled hands closing around the coins. Then she thanked him for the tea, said she needed time, and he said that was entirely reasonable and that he would not press her. She left Ashmore House and sat in the McCarthy carriage on the way back to Henrietta Street and looked at the great houses passing and felt the geometry of her situation shifting in a direction she had not anticipated and could not yet name. She would have more time than she needed. Events did not wait for her to arrive at a conclusion. Lady Pelham's Tuesday morning gathering was held in a drawing room on Brook Street that had been furnished with the specific intention of communicating the distinction between taste and expenditure. The curtains were garnet-colored silk that did not admit gray daylight so much as translate it into something more agreeable, and every surface held some small refinement. A lacquered box, a bowl of forced paper whites whose sweetness reached the doorway before the guest did, a fan opened to its full width and laid with apparent casualness across a chair arm. Lady Dorothea Pelham occupied the room's best chair as though she had been placed there by a man who understood composition, and beside her sat a young woman in pale yellow silk whose primary quality appeared to be perfect readiness to be arranged by someone with the judgment to do it. Nora had been included in the invitation at Robert's insistence. She wore the green gown. She sat near the window. She had been there 20 minutes when Lady Pelham rose from her chair, smoothed her skirts once with a hand that required no instruction from the eyes to know where its task lay, and came across the room to her. The woman was not cruel in any theatrical sense. She was, Nora had come to understand, someone whose entire intelligence was organized around the maintenance of the order she had inhabited for 60 years. And that order had categories, and Nora fell outside them, and this produced in Lady Pelham not malice, but a kind of practical dispassion she applied to most inconvenient facts. She sat beside Nora without being asked, placed her fan in her lap with precision, and addressed her with the warmth of a woman who believed she was being helpful. "I understand you have been receiving callers," she said. "I have," Nora said. "I wonder," Lady Pelham said in the tone of a person who does not wonder at all, "whether Lord Ashmore has been fully informed of the McCarthy family's present situation." She paused, precisely long enough to be deliberate. "No portion," she continued almost gently. "And Irish. These are not deficiencies of character. They are simply arrangements of fact." Nora did not allow her hands to move. "I appreciate your concern," she said. Her voice was level. It had been level in worse circumstances. Lady Pelham smiled with her mouth. "Lord Ashmore has a great deal to consider," she said. "His estate, his family's expectations, his own name." She opened the fan to a measured width, the sound of it like a single soft exhalation. "I believe you have met Mr. Caldwell. He is an excellent man. Solvent. Amiable. A very suitable arrangement for the right young woman." She rose then, unhurried, and returned to her chair, and the young woman in yellow tilted her head at something Lady Pelham said, and produced a small, practiced laugh, and neither of them looked back. Nora looked at the window. Outside, November was proceeding as it always did. The Paperwhites breathed their sweetness into the overheated room. 3 days later, at the same cold breakfast table, Robert told her. He had the manner of a man confessing something he had already done and could not undo, and he had done it 2 days before he told her, which was the part she felt most precisely. The coffee pot stood between them, its bottom still blackened from yesterday's carelessness with the flame. £2,000. The debt settled and forgiven. The terms not complicated. Nora to be engaged to Gerald Caldwell. The arrangement made formal before the end of the month. "You did not ask me," Nora said. "Nora." "You did not ask me," she said again, and there was no increase in volume, only the same sentence arriving twice in the same room. Robert looked at the table. He pressed his fingers against the tablecloth as he had pressed them to the surface before. The same gesture, the same helpless anchoring. He was a kind man who had run out of directions, and she found she could not hate him and could not forgive him. Not that morning. Not yet. She had already heard the label a 3rd time, delivered through Mrs. Finch, a neighbor in Henrietta Street who collected information with the systematic care of a woman who considered herself a public service and who had conveyed it over a Tuesday afternoon call with the genuine solicitude of someone who wished Nora to be informed rather than surprised. Mrs. Finch had sat across from her with her tea going cold in both hands, her voice lowered in the manner of those who deliver difficult things as gifts. Lady Pelham had been heard, at Lady Merton's card evening, to note that Lord Ashmore's interest in Miss McCarthy had been a momentary distraction from the practical realities of the matter. No portion, and Irish, and a brother with debts that made the whole question one of obvious resolution. 3 women at the card table had heard it stated without any effort at all. Nora thanked her and saw her out and stood in the entrance hall with her hand on the closed door. 3 rooms. 3 occasions. The verdict was not new, only more thoroughly distributed. At her writing table, she took out a sheet of paper and wrote to Julian. She did not labor over it. She wrote with the same precision she applied to household accounts, the same refusal to ornament what was plain. The pen was her mother's, a steel-nibbed thing resharpened so many times the handle was smooth as riverstone. She told him that her circumstances had changed in a way that released him from any obligation her situation might have created, and that she valued his honesty and wished him well, and that she did not want a man of genuine conscience to find himself caught in a transaction not of his making. She sealed it before she could read it back. She gave it to the hall boy to carry to Curzon Street, and went to the morning room and sat with the account book open and did not write anything in it. Stay with her, if you will. She is not finished. Leave a word in the comments if you have ever sealed a letter you did not wish to send. The reply came before the household was properly awake the following morning, carried by a man from Curzon Street who had been dispatched, apparently, as soon as the ink had dried. Nora read it at the writing table, still in her nightdress, the fire not yet lit, a single candle at her elbow throwing its small, wavering circle across the page, because she had not waited. He did not argue her assessment of his freedom. He did not cite obligation or propriety or the procedural logic of the situation. He said that he had read her letter twice and understood it entirely and intended to disregard it. And then he said why. He had turned Eleanor's portrait to the wall, he wrote. Not because he could not bear to see her face, but because he had needed the reminder that looking away from something did not alter what it was. He had spent 3 years confusing caution with care, and they were not the same thing, and he had taken too long to understand the difference. He did not want her because her situation aligned with his convenience. He wanted her because she had stood on a step in November and asked him a question he could not answer. and he had spent the intervening months finding the correct answer, and the answer was that he did not need her brother's permission, and he did not need anyone's permission, and what he required was only hers. Nora set the letter on the table. The candle flame moved slightly, though she could not determine from where the draft had come. She picked the letter up again. She read those last sentences a second time and felt in her chest the particular quality of a calculation that has been running quietly for some weeks, arriving at its result. Outside, the street was still gray with early morning, a cart horse moving somewhere below the window, the sound of iron wheels on stone diminishing into the distance. She dressed. She did not inform Robert of her destination. Lady Pelham's Thursday gathering was fuller than the Tuesday one. More candles. The garnet curtains had been drawn against the November light, and the room breathed with the accumulated warmth of 20 or more guests, their conversations threading together into a single complex sound, the way a river sounds different up close than from across the bank. The hierarchical arrangement of chairs around Lady Pelham's position reproduced with the precision of something long practiced. Robert arrived with Nora, and Caldwell came in behind them with the settled ease of a man who had not yet been told to put his good nature elsewhere. He had acquired a fresh pair of gloves, pale buff, which he had not yet fully worked loose at the fingers. Nora stood near the window. She did not perform ease. She occupied the most economical possible portion of the available space, as she had done in every room that had decided its opinion of her before she arrived. And she waited. She heard him before she saw him, or rather she heard the specific alteration in the room's social fabric that accompanied the arrival of someone whose presence reorganized the distribution of attention. Conversations contracted. Lady Pelham looked up from her companion. Caldwell's easy expression underwent a small and permanent adjustment, a slight setting of the jaw, the good nature still present, but removed now to a greater distance. Robert turned. Julian Barrow came into the room as a man who had settled his intention before arriving. He did not look at Lady Pelham. He did not look at Robert or at Caldwell. He crossed the room in 3 deliberate strides and stopped in front of Nora. The room went quiet in the manner of London drawing rooms, when something is occurring that everyone present understands will be repeated in other drawing rooms by evening. He did not take her hand. He did not perform the occasion for the audience it had acquired. He looked at her, with the same quality of attention he had applied to her in every room they had shared since the first assembly ball in King Street. And he said, quietly enough, that it was addressed to her, and clearly enough that the room required no effort to hear it. I am asking you. 3 months to answer. 2 words when he arrived at it. She had asked him why he needed permission from anyone, standing on a step in November with her shawl still over her arm, and here was the whole of his response. She looked at him. She felt in her body what the letter had told her, felt it as a fact in the chest and in the hands, and in the particular stillness that arrives before a thing that cannot be unmade. His eyes did not move from her face. She said yes. Julian turned to Robert. Not with urgency, not with anything that read as confrontation. He turned with the measured pace of a man who had one more thing to say, and intended to say it once. I required only her answer. Mr. McCarthy, he said. She has given it. Robert looked at his sister. He looked at her a long time, and what passed between them across the room was not quite an apology, and not quite absolution, but something that contained the acknowledgement of what he had done, and the understanding that she had answered in spite of it. She met his eyes and held them, and in that holding she communicated what she had not been able to say at the breakfast table with the cold toast between them, and he received it, and his hands dropped slightly at his sides. Caldwell said something at Robert's elbow. Robert turned to him. Whatever passed between them was inaudible. but its effect was plain. Caldwell reached for his gloves. He drew the buff pair from his coat pocket and worked his hand methodically into the first one. The fingers fitted with careful deliberateness, as though the action required his complete attention. And then he nodded, once, at no one in particular, and moved toward the door. And the door closed behind him with a quietness that required no commentary from anyone in the room. Julian addressed Robert then, in a tone that kept the room at its proper distance. The 2,000 pounds had been settled that morning. Robert was not to concern himself further with the matter. One sentence, plain and without conditions attached beyond the one already established in front of everyone present. Robert said nothing audible in reply, but his hand came up briefly and then fell, and the gesture was enough. Lady Pelham had watched all of this from her chair with the fan entirely still across her lap. She said nothing while it was occurring. There was nothing in the conventions of the gathering that permitted her to object, because what had occurred was a man asking a woman a question and a woman answering it, which was precisely the outcome the conventions of the season were designed to produce. And the fact that the arrangement had not followed her design was not something she could protest without protesting the result, and she was too intelligent for that. She met Nora's eyes once, across the width of the room, and what Nora read there was not contempt and not fury, but the briefest and most contained acknowledgement that she had been wrong about the category. Not an apology, a correction, arriving late and offered without fanfare. It was enough. Nora did not require more. The Ashmore estate in Warwickshire received them in late November, when the Trees had finished their argument with the season and come to their annual resolution. The house was large and cold in the way of old houses that take a week to fully warm, and Nora had spent the first 2 days moving through rooms that revealed themselves slowly. The library with its smell of leather and beeswax, the long passage that faced east and was bright by 9 o'clock and dark by 2, the kitchen garden below the study window where the frost lay in a thin permanent crust along the stones. The fire in the study had been lit that morning by someone who understood where a new arrival would want to be first. Nora stood at the study window on the first full evening and watched the snow begin. It came without announcement, the flakes dropping small and unhurried against the cold air, settling over the bare garden below the glass with the patience of something that had been intending to arrive for some time. On the mantelpiece, beside the clock, sat a pressed flower. It was dried flat and papery, its color still faintly gold at the center. She knew it at once, a chrysanthemum from the pot she had kept on the step at Henrietta Street, one of the late-blooming ones that had lasted into October. She had not known he had taken it. She had not known he had kept it. She did not speak. She looked at it for a long moment and felt something settle in her that had not been settled in a very long time. Behind her, Julian came in from the corridor with his coat still carrying the cold of the evening, and he stood in the doorway watching her at the window. The firelight moved across the books on the shelves, their spines the same worn brown and dark green she had seen in Curzon Street. She turned. The fire was between them. The snow was at the glass. Eleanor's portrait leaned against the study plaster exactly as it had leaned in Curzon Street, its canvas toward the wall. Nora did not ask for it moved. She did not need to. She was not a woman who required the erasure of what had been in order to inhabit what was. Julian had offered her Eleanor's full history before anything else, had made certain she understood what she was agreeing to, and she had agreed with the same accuracy she applied to every account she had ever kept. The portrait was a fact. She was here. These were not in conflict. She crossed the room toward the fire. He came in from the doorway. Outside, the snow continued, patient and indifferent to the arrangements of drawing rooms and seasons and the opinions of women in good chairs. He had asked her. She had answered. The rest was the house settling around them, and the fire, and the snow. If Nora's story moved you, leave a word in the comments. Stories about women who waited long enough to be asked are worth telling.